I was tossed out of my parents' home at age 18 because they considered me hard to handle, yet they funded my brother's privileged lifestyle. After they suffered a financial collapse and pleaded to live with me, I gave them his address and cut off all communication. The initial time I understood I was the problem child in the family was when I was 12. My younger brother, Grayson, had just emptied an entire box of cereal onto the floor while playing with our dog. My mother entered the kitchen, glanced at the mess, and turned to me with that look every child fears. "Samuel, why weren't you watching him?" she inquired. I argued that I was working on my homework at the dining table, but it made no difference. At the end of her scolding, I was grounded for not being responsible. That particular moment lingered. Initially, I thought I might have simply messed up without realizing it. Now, reflecting on it, I recognize it for what it truly was, the beginning of a trend that would influence my whole life. Throughout my childhood, Grayson was always favored. He was 2 years my junior, and everybody believed he was amiable and relaxed. He possessed that innate charm that caused people to want to excuse his faults. If Grayson didn't do his chores, it was because he was occupied. If I didn't do mine, it was because I was shiftless. If Grayson talked back to my parents, it was considered him expressing his opinion. If I did, I was viewed as rude. You understand how it was. By the time I reached high school, I had started to feel bitter about the unfairness. I wasn't. I always strive to be the perfect kid. I don't believe such a thing exists, even though I really gave it a shot. I always made sure my grades were good, avoided getting into any kind of trouble, and I even worked a job on the side, hoping to earn enough money to buy my own car. But Grayson, on the other hand, was failing his classes and breaking curfew quite frequently. Yet it appeared my folks were more focused on justifying his actions instead of making him take responsibility for them. "He's just going through a phase," they'd always say. Apparently, I wasn't entitled to the same understanding. The moment that truly broke me arrived when I became 18. I anticipated it being a significant event, a leap toward independence and adulthood. Instead, that year was when my parents threw me out. It all began with a petty argument. Grayson had taken my car without even asking yet again and left it with the gas tank empty. When I brought it up, he just gave me a dismissive look and said, "Mom and Dad will most likely give you some cash for gas if you just ask." That was when I completely lost it. I ran into the living room and told my parents that if Grayson wanted to behave like a grown-up, he needed to start acting like it. My mom's reaction was something I never would have predicted. "Samuel, you've been so difficult recently," she remarked, with a voice laced with that underhanded calmness that just makes your stomach sink. "Perhaps it's time you experienced what it's like to be on your own." Initially, I assumed she was just trying to intimidate me. However, just 2 weeks later, I returned home from my job to discover a collection of boxes in my room and my dad standing there. My arms were folded. "We've given you ample opportunities," he stated. "You're an adult now, it's about time you matured." That was the end, no debate, no advance notice, just a swift departure. I spent the subsequent few weeks bouncing between friends' couches as I frantically searched for my own residence. Eventually, I landed in a cramped studio with deteriorating wall coverings and a barely functional heating unit. It wasn't much, but it was exclusively mine. Conversely, Grayson's existence appeared to become even simpler. My folks gifted him a shiny, new automobile for his 16th birthday, and I later learned they were compensating him for his tutoring, his fresh wardrobe, and even a getaway to Hawaii. They didn't even bother to contact me. I wasn't outright furious, to be precise. I was desensitized. It felt as though they had made their selection, and I wasn't it. A particular instance from that initial year on my own sticks out in my mind. I was heading home from my second job, completely worn out, when I passed a lavish restaurant downtown. Through the glass, I saw my parents and Grayson at a table, chuckling and savoring steaks. I'm unsure why it affected me so deeply, but it did. I remained there on the pavement for a full 60 seconds, gazing before I continued on. That's when I resolved I wouldn't allow their dismissal to shape who I became. If they didn't want me in their lives, so be it. I would construct a life completely independent of them. It wasn't simple. I was employed at 2 separate jobs for years just to make ends meet, carefully saving every dollar I earned. There wasn't much room in my schedule for socializing, but I was all right with it. Each time I felt like quitting, I still think about that evening outside the restaurant. I swore to myself that I wouldn't ever be the one on the outside looking in ever again. Eventually, my circumstances began to improve. I got a better position at work, discovered a more pleasant apartment, and even succeeded in finishing paying off my car. When I hit 25, I had a steady job, a small group of good friends, and a life I felt good about. My parents remained a faded memory, and Grayson, well, he was living it up with their money. Sometimes I'd see his posts on social media, images of him relaxing on a yacht or celebrating in Vegas. I never enjoyed seeing them, but I also didn't block his account. I suppose a part of me was still intrigued. When I reflect on it, I can't say I have regrets about how things turned out. My parents had made their decision, and I'd made my own choices. But from time to time, in the late hours of the night, I would consider whether they ever thought about me, whether they ever felt bad about what they had done. I received an answer a few months ago when my mom sent me a text for the first time in ages. It read, "We need to talk. It's important." I tried to convince myself that I didn't care, that I was better off without them. However, a portion of me still questioned, what had I done that was so impossible to forgive? A few months ago, when my mom texted me out of the blue and said, "We need to talk. It's important," I didn't know how to respond. I looked at my phone for quite a while, trying to guess what she might want after 7 years of not communicating. Part of me considered ignoring it. I mean, what was the use of replying? They'd certainly made their feelings clear about where I stood with them. I hadn't spoken to her in ages, but I was just too curious. I texted her back a quick, "What's up?" and waited. An hour passed, then I got her reply. "Can we meet face to face? It concerns your father and me." That's when I knew something was up. My mom never asked for help unless she absolutely needed to. She had this pride, an almost irritating kind, and always gave the impression that she was on top of everything. The fact that she wanted to meet in person seemed strange. I agreed to meet her at a diner nearby the following day. I tried to convince myself that I was only going for the sake of ending things completely, not because I actually cared about their issues. But deep inside, I believed I secretly wanted something, perhaps a simple apology, or even just a recognition of how badly they had acted towards me. When I entered the diner, my mom was already seated at a booth, sipping a cup of coffee. She appeared older than I recalled. Her hair had strands of gray in it, and there were noticeable wrinkles around her eyes. For a moment, I almost felt sympathy for her. Then she lifted her gaze and smiled as if nothing was amiss. "Samuel," she greeted, rising for an uncomfortable hug. "You look well." "Thanks," I replied, settling into the seat opposite her. "So what is this about?" She paused, looking down at her coffee. "It's about your father and me and Grayson." Of course, it involved Grayson. It always did. She then started a lengthy explanation about how their company had suffered during the last few years. Something about some bad investments, a rather dishonest business associate, and how the market wasn't as strong anymore. I found my mind wandering a bit in the middle of their story, but the main idea was easy to grasp. They were in financial ruin, not just scraping by, but selling their house kind of broke. I interrupted, "And Grayson?" Her face became tense. "He's having a tough time, too." She explained that he was let go from his job last year, and it's been hard for him to locate new employment. "Your father and I have been helping him as much as we can, but with all of this happening, we simply don't have any funds left." I took that in. After all the years of paying for Grayson's life, his car, his trips, his getting his act together, they were finally feeling the repercussions. I stayed quiet, anticipating what she'd say next. "That's why we're hopping." Her voice faded, and she looked at me with anxiety. "We're hoping we could stay with you for a little while, just until we can get back on our feet." I almost snorted with disbelief. They want to live with me, the very same folks who tossed me out at 18 because I was difficult. The irony was almost overwhelming. "Are you serious?" I asked, leaning back. "Samuel, we would not even think to ask if we had any other alternatives," she said in a rush. "We only need a short amount of time, a few months at the most." I didn't know what to say. On one hand, they were my parents, I reminded myself. Conversely, they abandoned me when I was only just starting out on my own. And now, after years of zero contact, they wanted me to come to their rescue. It struck me as ridiculous. "Have you talked to Grayson about this?" I finally asked. Her expression changed. I couldn't expect anything else, really. Grayson never had it in him to help anyone besides himself. I told her I needed to consider it, rising to my feet. I was nowhere near being prepared to tell her what I thought. Not at this moment, at least. Though she looked let down, she didn't pressure me. "All right," she whispered. "Just try not to take forever, please." During the subsequent few days, that chat was all I could focus on. A piece of me felt bad even for being uncertain. Regardless of what had happened previously, they remained my relatives. Yet another part of me, the part that remembered standing across from that elegant place, seeing them joking and dining while I fought to make rent, just wouldn't release it. I got on the phone with a couple of my friends to get their viewpoints. Most of them were on my side, but one pal, Leo, was brutally honest. "Man, they weren't there for you when you required assistance. Why should you even care about them now?" he mentioned. "You've created a life for yourself independent of them. Don't permit them to bring you down." He had a valid point, but it wasn't that straightforward. I couldn't just pretend they didn't exist, could I? A few days later, I got a call from Grayson. It was the first time he'd communicated in years. "Hey, Sam," he said, his voice unusually subdued. "Mom said she spoke with you." "Yeah," I responded cautiously. "What do you want?" I wanted to say thanks for pitching in," he said. "It means a lot." "Wait, what?" I said, puzzled. "Mom stated you agreed to let them come stay," he said. "It was a shock that you would offer to do this. I felt my gut clench up. I hadn't given them the okay for anything. There was a noticeable delay before he spoke. "Oh," he finally said. "Well, you're sort of needed." That was the entirety of it. That instant was when it became clear that nothing had actually changed. They were still anticipating that I would fix their problems, much like I'd been supposed to look after Grace and all those years before. I put the phone down and stayed put, deep in thought for a while. I reflected on all the lonely evenings I'd spent in that freezing, small apartment, surviving on cheap ramen while I questioned whether I'd ever get my life in order. I considered the advancements I'd worked hard to get, the relationships I'd fostered, the life I'd created for myself. None of that had originated with them. When my mom sent me another text the following day, inquiring about my decision, I knew what to say. I sent her just one message. "You should speak with Grayson. I'm sure he'll find a solution." Then I shut down the communication with her. Last update. A week after I cut off contact with my mom, I heard an unanticipated knock on my door. It was approximately 8 p.m., and I wasn't anticipating any visitors. My first guess was that it was one of my neighbors wanting to borrow something. Our apartment building was the kind where people frequently requested things like sugar or tools. However, when I opened the door, I was stunned. It was Grayson. He stood there with a rumpled shirt, holding a large bag. His typical self-assured smile was replaced by a look that seemed almost like he was frightened. "Hey," he said, moving his weight uncomfortably. "May I come in?" I didn't budge. "What's the reason for your presence? Mom and Dad said you're barring them entry." He spoke, his voice sounding like an accusation. "They're really upset. They mentioned that they have nowhere else to turn, and that I'm simply abandoning them to suffer." I looked directly at him. "What exactly do you think I can do about their situation?" "Samuel, they are your parents," he stated, as if that somehow canceled everything they'd ever done. "They've always treated us well. And now they need assistance. You can't just exclude them." "Treated us well?" I questioned, my tone growing more agitated. "You mean they've been kind to you? You're just as aware as I am that they've never shown me the same level of care that they show you. You had everything provided for you without any effort, while I was out here trying to manage and make a living." Grayson let out a heavy breath as if I was being ridiculous. "I understand they weren't without fault." "Without any fault," I broke in. "They kicked me out when I turned 18, Grayson. I had absolutely nothing. No funds, nowhere to live. Nothing. Now they're asking to come and live with me since they've exhausted everyone else who's been helping them." "Nope," he began to say something in reply, but I quickly cut him off. "Why don't you offer them a place to stay? They favor you, isn't that right? Or is it because you're also strapped for cash now?" That comment caused him to stop talking for a moment. I thought he was going to leave. But then he said, "Okay, could I at least stay here for a little while? Only till I get things sorted." I felt like closing the door on him, but something held me back. Perhaps it was a desire to know more. Possibly it was the aspect of me that I was still searching for explanations. I moved to the side and let him come inside. Grayson tossed his bag near the couch and just sunk into a chair, acting like he was the landlord. I got a beer from the refrigerator and offered it to him, observing as he took a large gulp. So I began, taking a seat directly across from him. "What's the story? The last time I heard you were enjoying yourself on a yacht." He grimaced. "Yup, well, circumstances shifted. I got let go from my job last year, and then the credit card debt started to build up. Mom and Dad assisted for a little while, but with everything happening, they couldn't keep it up." "What about the car? The trips?" I questioned. "Gone," he plainly answered. "I got rid of the car to pay off certain debts, and the getaways, honestly, they were mainly for appearances anyway." I felt an odd combination of contentment and sympathy. It wasn't simple to feel sorry for somebody who had cruised along, depending on the kindness of others for years. Yet at the same time, he was still my sibling. We sat without speaking for a bit until he eventually stated, "I get it, you know." "Understand what?" "Why you're upset," he said, gazing at his beer. "I know they did you dirty, and I know I didn't necessarily make your life simple." I didn't reply. A piece of me hoped to trust him, but another piece was waiting for the hidden agenda. "But they're still our folks," he continued. "And no matter what they did, don't you think they should get another opportunity?" I leaned back, carefully scrutinizing him. "What's the real reason you're here, Grayson? Is it because you care about them or because you don't?" Did you want to handle this by yourself? His cheeks flushed with color. That's not right. Is it? I questioned. The sole reason you're here is because you've exhausted all other choices. It doesn't matter what they did to me. All you really want is for someone else to fix their problems. That discussion finished with him sitting there looking sullen on the sofa while I went to my room. I didn't get a lot of sleep that night, though. I kept mentally replaying everything he said, questioning if I was being too hard on him. A second opportunity. Did they actually earn it? The following morning, I got up early and left the house without saying much to Grayson. I required some time alone to process everything. As I moved around the city, I started to grasp something important. This wasn't just about their behavior any longer. It was about my reaction. For years, I'd let their disapproval dictate who I was. I had put in so much effort to prove that I didn't need them, but somehow they were still dictating the terms of my life. By the time I got back to my place, I had made my decision. When I went inside, Grayson was on the phone, walking back and forth. He looked up when he noticed me and swiftly ended the call. "Who was that?" I inquired. He stated, avoiding my eyes. "She wondered if I would talk to you." "Excellent," I replied. "Inform her that I will offer my assistance." His face brightened with happiness. "You're serious." "Sam, but only if one thing happens," I interrupted, stopping him. "They are going to regret what they did to me." His smile faded a bit. "What does that signify? You'll find out," I stated, making my way towards my room. The following week was, to say the least, incredibly fulfilling. I made the arrangements for my parents to relocate. I moved my parents and Grayson, my brother, into a place I leased. It was a shabby duplex I had purchased a couple of years earlier with the intention of renovating it. I said that this was the only option I had available on such short notice. Initially, they were appreciative, although it didn't take long for the grumbling to begin. There were issues with the pipes. The heating system hardly functioned, and the surrounding area wasn't secure. Each time they'd call me to voice their frustrations, I'd bring up the rent they weren't giving me and the things they still needed to do for me. It wasn't just about being mean. Perhaps it was a bit of that. The point was to get them to comprehend what I'd dealt with, what they'd caused me to endure. Grayson didn't stay very long after they moved in. One day he came to me, explaining he'd found somewhere to stay with a buddy and expressing his appreciation for my help. I didn't push back. I wasn't responsible for him anymore. My parents, however, are still there, discovering what life is like now that they don't have the comfort zone they always assumed they would. And I'm finally unburdened.